I don't emphasize this as much as I once did. Books are somewhat old. Your book says that larger horses were bred, but I think that part of the reason that knights became popular, I mean, the word knight means horseman, or man mounted on a horse. I think that mankind in those days became smaller also. That can be argued with, but as Europeans began to inbreed more and more, or not marry over the horizon more, they became smaller and smaller, and then the horses became larger. So between larger horses and smaller men, the horse could carry its armor, and the men can carry a man in armor. And the stronger horses are able to carry the armored knight. Eventually, at least Western European man became bigger when they started marrying over the horizon, marrying strangers. Again, for 500 years, knights dominated the battlefield. About hunting, I can't emphasize enough, only the nobility were allowed to hunt. The ordinary people were, and that's why when this country was founded, they wanted to make sure that everybody, including the commoners, could hunt. There are some restrictions placed. You have to have a license. Loyalty, fealty, vassalage, all these, fief, all these are parts of the element of feudalism. Feudal system. It came about with when kings were not strong. I mentioned three groups that invaded Europe in the 1000s or so: the Muslims, the Magyars, and the Vikings. The Muslims wound up taking over the southern part of Spain and holding it for hundreds of years. The Magyars settled in Hungary, where they'd found their relatives, the Huns. I mean, both the Huns and the Magyars were from the same part of Asia. But the Magyars settled where the Huns had already settled. Eventually, Europe rose up against them and clobbered them in a battle. And they settled down and built a nation known as the Kingdom of Hungary. The Vikings, they eventually settled down also. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. A place called Scandinavia. They converted to Christianity, as did the Magyars. They started their raids while Charlemagne was still alive. He was able to keep them in check and, you might say, chase them off. But then, after he got gone, there were not strong kings in Europe anymore. Local nobles had to keep armies because they never knew where the Vikings would strike. This broke up a lot of the power of the central government. Oh yeah, the most powerful ruler of France during his time, the only one France calls the Great, is Charlemagne. That's short for Charles the Great. If you read a detailed account of Charlemagne's life, it went like this. Each year, in the spring, he'd lead out an army against the Saxons. They'd fight for a while, usually with Charlemagne winning. Then in the fall, they'd all return home, settle in for the winter, and then in the spring, go against them again. It reminds you of maybe big league ball teams. In the winter, they rest. In the spring, they get together and play their ball games during the summer and early fall. Then they rest for the winter, get together in the spring, and repeat the whole cycle over again. Same thing here, except they were fighting with real swords and fighting for keeps. The problem with the Saxons, they did not have a strong central government. They were a barbaric people who lived in tribes, more or less, and eventually the tribes were absorbed by the rest of Europe. You don't hear much about the Saxons in modern times. Oh yes, something about these people, monks. Male members lived in a monastery. Nuns, female members lived in a convent. When you associate monks with a monastery, nuns with a convent. 3 things they vowed: poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they kept busy. They are the ones who are credited with keeping alive knowledge through the Middle Ages, and a lot of times their works that they copied from old times were put in containers and not looked at for hundreds of years. And I've already mentioned how that during the Renaissance there was an attempt to dig up these old manuscripts and recopy them and revive them. And this period of time was called the Renaissance. The monasteries served as schools, colleges, libraries, hospitals, and churches, you might say, all rolled into one. They were the intellectual center of Europe. And they did a lot to keep learning alive in Europe during a time that used to be called the Dark Ages. Pope Gregory, again, it depends on what you call Pope. If you read a history of the papacy, you'll find that some of the popes early on claimed that they were over the whole church, but most of them didn't. But finally, you came up with one named Gregory who said that I'm the head of the entire church. He was able to get by with it partly because he was so well liked. He set up monasteries, missionaries, converted to Germans, and set up the Gregorian calendar, as I've already mentioned. What made the Pope so powerful? Well, when the political system declined, the Pope was the one strong man of the hour. And when people went to Rome looking for help, well, they said, would tell them, in effect, the emperor is no longer here, but here's where the Pope lives, and he can do more for you than anyone else. So the church began to take over functions that were formerly done by the state, including the issuing of marriage licenses, performing wedding ceremonies, and this is still something that continues to this day. The state still issues marriage licenses, but most people still don't consider themselves married until they've had a church wedding. Now, this is being greatly weakened and undermined in recent times, I'm aware. But again, you weren't considered married until you had a church wedding and a bishop or a priest pronounced you man and wife. Oh yes, right here. 3 words, don't remember: Wehrgeld, compurgation, ordeal. What's that?
Trials.
These were different ways to try to determine innocence or guilt. The Wehrgeld was a fine. In other words, where the larger the crime and the more important the person offended was, the higher the Wehrgeld. The Wehrgeld was a fine. See, before this time, at one time, if you committed a crime, your family, the offended person's family was going to come after you. So if you committed a crime against a member of another family, that family would be expected to come after you. And that was, the Romans finally convinced the German people, hey, no, wait, this is wrong. This is a matter for the state to decide. So if somebody commits a crime against somebody, tell the state and let the state magistrates handle it and let them decide guilt or innocence. But it's not a matter for another family to come and take vengeance. And of course, this led to family feuds that would last sometimes for generations. The most famous being the family feud between between the Montagues and Capulets and the Romeo and Juliet story. And in my personal life, there was one between the Montgomerys and Cunninghams that lasted a while. Also, the Cunninghams and Kennedys did not get along very well either. In our own history, the most famous such feud was the Hatfields and McCoys. But to try to keep this feuding down, it said civilized people go to court and let the courts decide on guilt or innocence. Again, ordeal. Where the person would walk on a bed of hot coals or lie on a bed of spikes, and if he healed quickly, he was presumed to be innocent. Clovis of the Merovingian dynasty united France, converted to Arian. Wait, no, he was the first king to convert to Roman Catholic Christianity. The others had converted to Arian Christianity. Again, Arian Christianity was very, very powerful during the 200s, 300s, and 400s. And to think of all these movements in Christianity today, you don't hear of Arianism anymore. It almost completely died out. In fact, hardly any Christian will admit that he's a convert to Arianism, but it was very prominent at one time. Visigoths took over Spain. Then they set up small kingdoms. Because they were not united, they were conquered by the Muslims. One of the Briton kings supposedly who fought the Germans was King Arthur. In England was settled by the Angles and Saxons. The Angles, how we get the word England or Angleland. The English are sometimes called the Anglo-Saxons. Vandals, they destroyed a lot of the Roman Empire. We get our term vandalism from their actions. One of the biggest invasions that hit Europe at this time was the Huns, led by Attila the Hun. Between them and the Bulgars who came later, they founded the modern nation of Hungary. One of you did a report on Attila the Hun, by the way. Some of the popular topics in the papers were, of course, Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, and Genghis Khan. All right. Let's see. Again, these are the old notes I used to use, but by way of some more review, what is the dominant religion of Japan? What's that?
They don't really have one, right?
They're the most least enthused about the religion group of people, but there is one religion that they have embraced more than any other, Shintoism. And one of its beliefs is that the emperor is divine. Now again, they're very indifferent to that today. Their emperor is somewhat little regarded, but they believe that the emperor was divine, and it should be obeyed without question. All right. What religion wound up taking over much of Southeast Asia? Buddhism. Buddhism. Hey, that was brought home with the weekend when my daughter came home from UGA and missed that on the test. And I sat down and had a talk with her. One thing the professor wanted I have not mentioned was why was Buddhism preferred over Hinduism in Southeast Asia? And the answer is the Southeast Asian people were more egalitarian, and Buddhism is a more egalitarian religion. I mean, that's probably a reason. I mean, this is speculative, you understand. You can never say for sure. I mean, but if you had been a Southeast Asian person and your ancestors had been animistic or spirit worshippers, and you decide you want to adopt a religion that's more civilized or from a more civilized people, and you had a choice between Hinduism and Buddhism, you might possibly have adopted Buddhism, partly because your neighbors were, and partly because it was simply more egalitarian than the hierarchical system of the Hindus.